Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast, powered by ISOFIT, Oro Muscles, and Firefly Recovery. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training. For more on ISOFIT, be sure to check out isofit.com. Oro Muscles revolutionizes rehabilitation with real-time actionable insights into muscle activity with live biofeedback and instant analysis, which has made a huge impact in my work with athletes. For more on Oro, be sure to check out oromuscles.com. Episodes like this are also made possible by Firefly Recovery, the official recovery provider of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. For more on Firefly, be sure to check out recoveryfirefly.com. Today I'm joined by Michael Fahey, where we discuss a variety of different considerations surrounding Westside barbell, velocity-based training, and training in general. And this is a really fun conversation. I enjoyed talking with Michael and really learning a lot from his insights and perspectives and experiences, and I know you're going to love this one. Enjoy. Michael, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your time. For people who might not be familiar with you or your backstory that way, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and how you've gotten into this world of sports performance that way?
First off, thanks for having me. So I was an athlete when I was younger. I have one of probably the more bizarre stories of getting into this field that you could have. I played mostly football and track. I was a thrower. I played, on the front seven, basically on both sides of the ball as a football player. And at the last minute, my senior year, a couple of weeks before signing day, I had this epiphany that I didn't want to be an athlete at the next level, though I had some opportunities. I decided instead that I was going to go to film school. So again, getting into before this. Yeah, getting into just before this, not sure how much of my story you're aware of, but I decided to go to film school, went to Florida State. I'm from Tallahassee. I live in Tallahassee now. I got kicked out of film school because there was massive cutbacks to the funding for the arts and things like that. My major was deemed, non-necessary. So I ended up finishing out at Florida State through the School of Communications and a program called media production, which basically is just like, it was like film school, but without the, sort of air of glamour and mystery to it. No one understood what it was that I was doing, probably not even my parents. But I graduated in 2009, walked across the stage, and then the next day moved out to Los Angeles, got an internship on a documentary that was about whole foods, plant-based diet. That ended up being a movie called Forks Over Knives that was pretty popular. Honestly, like weirdly, the largest thing that I've been associated with at this point. But I was like a hired gun on that. I was just a young kid. I wanted to go be a writer and director and basically be like a third Coen brother or a Wes Anderson clone going out to LA. But with my sports background, and again, I'm a fairly large person. I'm like a small giant, 6'3", 250 right now, though I've recently been considerably heavier. So, and I had at least the opportunity to play sports at a higher level. And all of that basically made me an oddity and a novelty out in the world of production. And so I started getting a lot of sports kind of centered opportunities. I worked for the NFL for a few years at NFL Network and did a lot of stuff on the combine and worked on like Mike Mayock shows in the production side of things for a few years, mostly as an editor. And being an editor, you get a lot of work, but I didn't really like it. I still don't really like it. I'm good enough at it that people keep offering me work to do it. But I wanted to tell stories, and that all this very roundabout way, I ended up almost on accident telling somebody about the story of Westside Barbell. And from there, I quickly started getting calls about developing reality shows based on Westside Barbell. If you're familiar with Westside and Louis Simmons and sort of any of the mystery or lore about him, you'd probably know like reality TV and Westside don't seem like they go together. But I was just struck by the idea that like someone who did not have a sporting background at all thought that that was a cool enough premise. It was a young vegan woman from Simi Valley who had never played an organized sport in her life, thought that was a good enough basis to invest a large sum of money behind was, number one, that story had legs. And then number two, that my skill in telling it, because that was her job, was she basically found reality projects. So I got a lot of confidence from that, decided to drop off of all the other projects that I was working on. 2014, approached Louis Simmons about turning his story and the story of Westside into a documentary. Flash forward 4 or 5 years, because that's how long documentaries take. I released Westside versus the World. It was pretty much, me and a couple of hired guns who came on to do things like the music and help me with some sound mixing and things like that. But it was a very personal project that, saw me spending months at a time in Columbus, Ohio, in the gym with Louis, with all of these lifters. I had first visited Westside when I was 12 years old. Before that, in the mid 90s, my father, who was he got a CSCS. He was a stockbroker by day who played semi-pro football in the afternoons until he was 37, which is how old I am now, which is insane. He was a starting middle linebacker on a semi-pro team where literally he would, he made his money in the market. And then at 4:00, he put on his cleats and he ran out the door and he played against a bunch of, kids who were fresh out of FSU and FAMU who were trying to extend their football careers. And he literally didn't care about the pay or anything. He just, was excited to get to continue playing a sport. But so with all of that, I knew guys like Louis and Dave Tate and, was familiar with Elite FTS and, dynamic effort waves and things. And the basic concepts of some sort of early VBT, I knew that the Westside's dynamic effort wave was supposed to be 0.7 to 0.9 meters per second. And I knew the sets and rep schemes, from literally middle school. That was how training was introduced to me. We trained in monolifts out of our 2-car garage. I squatted against bands and chains. So those concepts, that idea of, weight wasn't heavy or light, it was fast or slow. That was the native way that I was introduced to training from a very young age. So flashing forward all the way to, 2019, the movie comes out on Netflix. I've moved to Orlando by then. And finally, I convinced my wife to move back to Tallahassee. Not long after, I was approached by someone who said, you've been around all these coaches and stuff. They knew that I was still training out of my garage. I was very strong. I had a small group of people who trained with me, and it was literally just so that I would have training partners. And somebody approached me and said, hey, your old high school needs help. Would you be willing to, come in, and maybe if it was just as a volunteer consultant or something, just kind of, could you come write something on the board that we could copy and run for a few weeks? And I came in, what was supposed to be 3 days. I came in, they asked me to do a 4th day. And then after that, I said, I told my wife, I love doing this. This is way more fun than making documentaries, which is a very slow, kind of grinding pace. That was my favorite part in making Westside versus the World, was nerding out and talking about the training and actually being in the gym and having an excuse to basically anyone that I wanted to talk to on YouTube or, any coach from around the world. I mean, I went to Perth, Australia and met with, pro rugby staffs out there because of the movie, and got to just talk shop. And, I got to meet Coach Batson's staff at Clemson, or Coach Gillespie's staff at the time at Liberty, and Buddy Morris or Pete Prinzi, or I got to meet all these people. And especially on the track and field side, getting to talk to the people who, because at Westside there were visitors every day. You'd have the power lifters, come lift in the morning, and then another group in the afternoon. But through the middle of the day, it was just strength coaches and sport coaches coming to visit, and they'd all sit down and, they'd all get the same basic tour. They'd get the same basic spiel from Louis every single day. And you'd get new people asking Louis different versions of essentially the same questions. And so you get to hear the explanations from so many different angles. And I learned so much about the training. And that part was so much more exciting to me than the actual making a movie. And so getting back into the gym, I immediately was like, this is what I want to do. And then my wife said, well, are they going to pay you? And I said, no, it's a public school in Florida. We're a no income tax state. our politicians commonly say things to us like we're a low tax, low service state, meaning, like there's a reason why we can't keep teachers. It's because we don't pay anyone. So they certainly aren't paying strength coaches down here. So I said, no, the only way I'd be able to do this is if I did it for free. And she said, well, then you have to figure out a way to make money off of it. Now, no point in my life have I, except for about a 6-week span when I was in college, I worked at a bookstore. But aside from that, I've never been an employee. I started my first business at 18. I've always been a contractor and a consultant and a business owner. And when my wife told me that and didn't just say like, no, you're crazy, I'm going to leave you, I thought like, okay, there's got to be an angle here to make this work. And then I conceptualized a company that now is OVR, OVR Performance. And first thing I went about doing was I had some VBT units, I had jump mats and things. And I said, like number one, like I want to teach people how to use these things. I want to train athletes for free. I want to make this stuff more accessible to more people. So I want to figure out a way to make it at greater scales with better delivery mechanisms, and also to approach the process and utility of these items from a means that like fit my unique needs as a coach. Because at that point, I'm coaching, I would commonly have 80 or 90 kids in a large weight room, and it would just be me. So I had to develop a lot of systems just logistically to figure out how do you deliver, how do you try and deliver a fairly complex conjugate system to a room full of high school boys with no help. How do you simplify things down and create mechanisms, say with the VBT, to kind of like create guardrails to keep people where we're doing enough that we get adaptation and we get severe adaptation, but also where we're still safe. And so that ended up being like great R&D for OVR. And now that's, 4 years later, basically that's sort of a reality now. The company's up and running, and we've been servicing a lot of coaches over the last few months, all across the country and the world.
Yeah, I mean, first off, you have such an incredible backstory there, Michael, and it's so interesting. This has come up a lot with people lately, how they always kind of end up finding the right path for them in the end, but everyone's journey to get there looks a little bit differently. And I'm sure as you were kind of starting out, embarking in studies for film, you didn't necessarily think, I'm going to become a volunteer high school strength coach someday. But here you are, and it's amazing how we always kind of find our path to what we're truly passionate about. And I mean, the individuals that you've gotten to work with and the names that you mentioned, I feel like are household names, and have had so much impact on the profession in general. I mean, you mentioned Louis Simmons and Westside a number of times that way. And obviously, I miss the insights that he shared that way. It's unfortunate that he was taken from us a little too soon, in my opinion. But the stuff that he did with Westside is absolutely revolutionary. And I see that impact carrying on, and that's a legacy that's going to, far exceed his short time here with us that way. And obviously, you mentioned that VBT was a big concept of what they were doing. And you mentioned that you knew ratios and numbers from the time that you were in middle school, high school, when most kids have never even heard of velocity-based training before. And obviously now with OVR, one of the things that I think the majority of us love about what you've done from the company standpoint is you've made these advanced technological things that I think everyone has kind of recognized as this is important to integrate in training. You've made those affordable to the point where now we can actually use them across pretty much any and every setting. For a long period of time, I was looking at the cost of different VBT devices for myself clinically in physical therapy, and I was having a very difficult time justifying some of the cost because, to be honest with you, we face some issues in physical therapy where we may or may not be getting paid enough for the work that we do. Our reimbursement rates don't tend to get better. But at the end of the day, we need to produce results and outcomes. And I think that using VBT is a great way to do that, especially in our lower extremity, like mid to late stage ACL rehabs. And I think the other component too is VBT is a common language that more and more people speak nowadays. Almost every high performance facility, almost every D1 college that I've worked with that way, they're using VBT. So if they're using VBT, I better use VBT as well. And I think that there's a lot of different ways to use VBT in the sense that you can use it from a bit of a monitoring standpoint, in the sense that, hey, last week athlete was able to move this weight at this velocity, and now they can't. But you can also obviously use it from a training standpoint to ensure you're putting enough load through the system to elicit the response that you want to, right? Are we trying to develop speed adaptations? Or are we trying to develop absolute strength adaptations? So I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how you've seen the evolution of VBT across your, multi-decade career here, but also how you've been able to integrate it on your own end into practice that way with the kids that you work with. What kind of things are you using VBT for from a programming standpoint, or other applications that you've seen for VBT that way?
The popularity of VBT, it's really exploded in the last, probably the last 3 years. I've seen a big uptick in it. And obviously that's come with some products finally having prices start to fall. There are a few products that, at least in theory, cost less than ours, but for the specific type of product that we sell, the OVR Velocity, I believe for that style of VBT, a tethered unit, that those tend to be a good deal more accurate and consistent. We're the lowest. We don't have a subscription fee. So just as you said, a lot of coaches, spend so much time, especially if you don't, if you're not getting a residual check from Netflix and Amazon, especially if you're on a high school salary, or, even at most coaches, even at large colleges, are not making a ton of money unless you're lucky enough to, become the head guy of a major sport, say football. So for most coaches, to come out of pocket to just get a single unit so that they can start tooling around with it, it has been such a prohibitive thing. And I've been that coach who is looking around seemingly endlessly, and you've got a list of products that you want to have. You're almost waiting for that day, when you can finally, when all the bills are paid and all the expenses and everything on the horizon is accounted for, and now you've got an extra grand lying around, you can finally get that first unit. Even then, if your idea is to ultimately move on to a larger commercial use or a team setting, having one is having none. It's cool ideas and it's cool theory. And along with that, the really exciting thing about sort of a democratization of any technology is that there is the training field in general is so young. It's such a young field. And as a result, there's not actually that much information that everyone's educations are based on, and if you've ever written anything, to write a book or write a movie, you realize that so much gets left out, so much context gets left out, even when you have the ability to use video and audio and have multiple means. What might be a 10-minute section in a movie might be a 10-month, living curriculum in real life. If we were training together every day, it would take so long for you to see sort of all of the nuances, and that you would see if, say, if you were tracking your lifts 3-4 times a week, and then especially if you're tracking the lifts of every athlete, so there's so much information out there that, especially the Soviet information, where you can't go talk to the authors anymore. Many of them have passed. You get very little context as to things like training age or the background of those specific athletes. And, so many things that are their theory in super training, and so few people get to play around with them in real life. And that's where all of those old Soviet texts that our field is based on, you have to remember, those people coached for decades before writing it. And when they write it, 99% of what goes into the actual training is stripped out just for economy of words, to simply have a conversation in which there's sort of a linear train of thought, which, as you can see, I'm particularly bad at. I'm like interviewing a cloud. I float away on tangents at every moment. But So yeah, like, in, let's say, for instance, Louis would talk all the time, you go read the Book of Methods or something, his text from the late 90s even, and he's saying zero point 0.7 to zero point 0.9 meters per second. Like, number one, he's saying that because they had tendos, so even way back in the 90s, Louis, who was an infamously like anti-technology guy, because he was old and crotchety and didn't like new things, like old crotchety men don't like new things. But they had a period of time where he got tendos, and just because he wanted that frame of reference for himself of what is fast enough, what isn't fast enough, at what speeds. I challenge most people to go move 85% of your one rep max at zero point 0.7 meters plus per second. Most people cannot do that. Louis guys could do that. Why? Because Louis guys were highly trained powerlifters with really high work capacities who, because of the way that they trained, absolute and, and dynamic effort where velocity was the huge emphasis. And they also did a lot of things like box jumping frequently. So he was cognizant within his training of this idea of like, I can't just grind them down to a one rep max because they'll overly adapt to that. I need to provide something else that sort of balances out that, balances them along the force velocity curve. And also, though, I need them to move fast enough that those loads are contextually light enough to them that they are able to recover from that. He couldn't do, like, say, a Bulgarian system from, the old Soviet days of basically a daily max, especially in, bench, squat, deadlift. That would be so brutal. Like, a very young steroid fueled lifter might be able to tolerate that for a while, but not long enough to set a world record in most instances, or if they did set a world record, they weren't going to set a third or fourth. They were going to break something and then break something. For Louis, that idea of measuring strength and speed like contextualized all of training. And again, that's sort of the natural lens that I view everything from. I now work with younger athletes. So when we do our dynamic effort work, as I sort of was alluding to there, younger, weaker people, less developed athletes, they cannot move 75 to 85% at 0.7 to 0.9 meters per second, which means they can't move it that fast because their absolute outputs are not high enough, right? As you get stronger, you both gain the ability to go slower and to go faster. Your force velocity curve expands. We do a test all the time called Velo Bench, which is a thing that I just came up with and started doing. And the idea being sort of something analogous to like a medicine ball throw or something like a power ball throw that, the old Spark scores used to do. An upper body power assessment that I really like the power ball, but throwing, a 3K or a 6-pound medicine ball as far as you could from a kneeling position. I really liked that as a replacement to, say, like a rep bench test that the NFL or a lot of college camps still do. I like that because it became almost more like a low skill shot put. And I saw that with my own athletes that the kids who excelled in that were the kids who were also much more likely to end up with college scholarships. So, it biased towards generally desirable body types and traits of athletes, but it requires a lot of space, throwing a medicine ball 40 feet, maybe 50 plus feet on the bounce. I wanted to do something similar that we could test frequently. And so I arrived at like, well, we'll just move the empty bar from a pause as fast as we can and look at the average velocity of that. And one of the first things that I saw was, number one, that a lot of the velocity based sort of calculators and stuff, like it's assumed that there's a linear relationship between velocity and, your one rep max and like that's not really true when you start to look at it. Again, a more experienced lifter can grind slower, but they can also move a lighter weight faster. In looking at that, I was showing my kids, and I did this literally yesterday. I hit my best score in it. I hit 2.09 meters per second on a velocity bench rep. So a 3-second pause off of my chest, and then boom, just accelerating as fast as I could to the top. I hit 2.09, which ties my best athlete ever for the top that I've personally seen. First time I did this, I noticed, with our baseball team, our strongest guys were not the ones who dominated this test. Though I have a 450-pound bench. 455 is my best all-time one-rep bench. I can't do that right now because I just lost 50 pounds. But, in showing the kids, like, you all should be faster than me. You all should be able to move, your empty hand faster than I can because you're younger, right? You have more neural efficiency. And yet I only have one kid who, taking the tether, can move literally his empty hand faster than I can. And at 37, I should be slower than I was, say, at 27. And 27 should be slower than 17. But because my absolute strength is so high relatively, my own arm represents such a light weight of my own potential output that I can move my own arm faster than these young kids who throw, 80 plus miles an hour off the mound. They can beat me on the mound all day. But if you simplify the exercise, I can actually move faster at the top end than they can. It's because I'm stronger. However, I'm so much stronger than them to be just a tad bit faster. Right. So as they get stronger, there's an extremely high correlation between their improvements in absolute strength and their improvements on velocity with a minimal weight implement. But so with all that, I can move both. So my dynamic effort as a more mature, athlete is I would have to move faster. They need to be throttled down. So where Louis was saying, I want my strongest guys training, between 0.7 and 0.9, which again is representative of relative percentages, right? If the Soviets way back when had access to, affordable VBTs that were just everywhere, we wouldn't have Soviet systems that were based on percents. The percents are themselves proxies for speed. Like even when you can't afford VBT, you're still training off of a VBT principle, whether you know it or not. The percent is just a proxy for the speed, right? And that's also why, people who, even when they train with percents, if they're intentionally trying to, if they're trying to use compensatory acceleration, they're going to get a greater response than if they're not, because the same percent on the same piece of paper, if the intent, the idea of that percent of load is to slow you down when proper intent is applied. When you start looking at weight as like simply a constraint for speed, and that constraint is to allow for more time for the tension to be created to allow you to get whatever your desired adaptation is. That's why sprinters have to jump. It's because jumping takes a longer impulse through the ground so they can build more tension, even though once they get sprinting, they're going to be moving so fast. That's why sprinting doesn't ultimately just create a linear progression of sprinting, is because you hit this terminal velocity where you are moving so fast that you can't create enough tension to even sustain your own movement. And it becomes so fast that it's not creating enough tension to stimulate an adaptation on your own body. So you have to slow it down. So you slow it down to a jump. And then you go, well, what's slower than an unweighted jump? A loaded jump, and so we do dumbbell jumps. We do our regular jumps and dumbbell jumps. We do acceleration sprints, short sprints. We do longer sprints, max velocity. But you go, well, what keeps slowing it down so that we can build just a little more tension that will link kind of one step further back. And eventually you get to, I used to train a sprinter who was a sub 20-second 200-meter guy, of which, there's only been roughly 100 ever. But I would have him do his dynamic effort wave from 1 meter per second would be his slow week. So his third week, slightly lower volumes. His middle week would be 1.1 meters per second. And his light week, his first week, would be 1 meter per second. So he was actually training at a faster speed than the power lifters that I would watch at Westside. But then when I get into the high school setting, my stronger kids might go zero 0.7 on their first week, zero 0.6, or real strong kids might go zero 0.8 because zero 0.7 might take too much out of them. So they go 0.8, 0.7, 0.6. So I've kind of slowed them down a gear. But my youngest kids, my middle schoolers, my freshmen who didn't have a training background in middle school, because I'm at a K through 12 school, they're generally, most of my kids are generally going to start off around somewhere, like a 0 0.6, 0 0.5, 0 0.4, so they're really getting into more of a brief maximal tension, where if you looked at from the perspective of like the textbooks, you would say like, well, they're not in that dynamic effort range at all. But the truth is, this is a weird concept. It's hard to explain the language around, like, without visuals. But again, like, your force velocity curve when you're weak and young, you can't create much strength on the vertical axis, you can't create much force, and you can't create much speed on the horizontal axis. So as your strength goes up, your potential to create speed goes up. So you can't get down to, say like sub 0.2 meters per second with a young kid. They're going to hit, like, they might hit almost 0.3 meters per second on the bench and immediately go down. The second their brain the second they're slowed down to just an unnatural position for themselves, they're going to just shut off. So in that sense, you can use VBT like a guardrail and say, especially with your younger athletes, you need them to go slow enough to create, because they're young, so they can't go super fast. So you don't have to worry about the super fast adaptations. You literally need to worry about, are we forcing them to grind slow enough that they create some sort of absolute force adaptation, some sort of like raising of their maximal strength. Once that is high enough, now there's sort of room within that curve. That curve starts to grow large enough that now we can start to segment that into a maximal day, a dynamic day. But in the early goings, it'll just be like a brief maximal tension mishmash. And then when you have really young kids, they don't actually know what it means they don't know what intention is. Like, they think that they're trying, but they don't know what trying feels like. But what they do all know is they all know video games. So you give them suddenly a score and a number, and all of a sudden they start to build this internal context of, what does it feel like to go 1 or 2 100ths faster? And it starts to help to get them. The great cruelty of working with young people, whether it's in athletics or anything else, but especially in athletics, is that their bodies are at the most adaptable, pliable. Every day when you see them, that is the most adaptable and pliable physical shape they will ever be in. Every single day, they're going to be less adaptable. But it's also every day you are seeing them, like, the next day they're going to be less adaptable physically, but the next day they're going to be better equipped conceptually to deal with the sort of like abstract nature of thinking that helps you to learn.
Right.
So the mind and body are working in this inverse process.
Right. You broke down so many amazing points there, Michael. And just to try and summarize and bring it all back together here. I mean, first off, I really love your concept of the velo bench that way, following a 3-second pause. And it's interesting because that's been one of the things that I look for a lot with this use of technology lately, is how can we kind of use technology to develop new and alternative outcome measures and test that way, and kind of get a deeper look at the system that we wouldn't have been able to appreciate otherwise that way. And I think the velo bench makes a really great entry for that. I mean, that's something you could literally run that number every time you work with your athletes when they're benching that way. Like, I don't know about you, at least for me, I always start benching an empty bar. So it's really easy to hit a 3-second pause and then push it as quick and as hard as you can. And on that note as well, I'm not a huge fan of the term load management for myself personally. However, I know that there are people out there who are probably way smarter than me that live and die by the term. So if that's your wheelhouse, if that's your camp, this is such an easy way to get a little bit of like a CNS load monitoring during the season that takes very little time, right? Set up your
Hmm.
velo bench, see what the average velocity was, graph it out week to week that way, and just kind of see what those numbers show you and what story they tell you. And I think retrospectively, there's going to be a lot that we can look back on and take away from that in the future that way. And as you were talking too about absolute strength versus speed that way, you have such a high absolute strength compared to the individuals that you work with, like you outlined, you're able to move a bar just as fast as they are, when in reality, they should be moving it significantly faster. I'm willing to bet you probably don't throw a baseball 80, 85 miles an hour.
No.
But, relatively speaking, it's very similar, if not the same musculature when we look at a bench press, right? We have internal rotation of the shoulder and so on that way.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, it's interesting to kind of think of this concept of, how important is absolute strength? Because on one hand, you're able to do exactly what you're able to do, and that you're able to compete with kids 20 years younger than you and still hang with them. On the other hand, they're able to perform in sport a lot better than you're able to perform in sport. Now, adding a little
Hmm.
context to that, I don't know many 37-year-olds who don't play baseball that can throw a ball 85 miles an hour.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it kind of opens up the door for this conversation of what component of strength is necessary for performance, and how do we kind of adapt what we do in the weight room to enhance the on-field thing. Because while I think a lot of kids are starting to take the strength training more seriously, there's still a number that I've met that don't seem to care. They just want to
Hmm.
play their sport, and they want to play their sport well. And even when you show them that doing stuff in the weight room will enhance what they do on the field, they're just not fully bought in. And that's where, you mentioned the concept of gamifying what we do a little bit and attaching the number and the score to things. And, it's funny because I bring up this concept of the kids love to play video games nowadays quite a bit. And that's something I just personally can't relate to, but I certainly think that there's an element of competitiveness that makes them want to put more effort, and that makes them interested and more engaged in things than they would be otherwise. And I think that that's certainly a nice element that we can start to work in to the work that we do in performance and rehab settings, is if we can make it a little bit more like a game to the kids, and they are
Hmm.
more willing to buy in and actually do the training and take it seriously, then that's a transaction I'm willing to make day in and day out. I think everyone will agree that, proper regular training is good for the athletes. And obviously it's good beyond just performance. It's good from a longevity piece as well. It's not just, I want them to be strong and healthy and perform well now. I also want them to be able to do that 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line. So when they're 37, they can still hang with the 17-year-olds and, whatever kind of competitive element you're looking at it as. So I think that
Yeah.
the concept of making training more engaging to the athlete is really, really essential, especially in today's day and age, because I find a lot of the times if I can't keep the kids engaged, it's almost like their attention span is a little bit shorter and they just don't want to be a part of it. The other thing that you
No.
mentioned that I really want to bring up again as well is, plain and simple, the whole reason we put weight on a bar is to restrain motion. So, more weight, it's going to be harder. It's going to take more time under tension to move the bar that way. And it's so interesting because I think people forget that. I ask 10 different people why we put weight on the bar. I'm going to get 10 different answers. Some are going to say to get stronger. Some are going to say to get bigger. And very few think, oh, yeah, it's just to restrict movement. So going back to what you mentioned on the force velocity curve, understanding that where we end up training on that force velocity curve is going to have very different effects. But just because we have a high load and it forces us to move slower doesn't mean we couldn't move a lighter load slower. It's just a matter of, is that the best way to do it? And is that the adaptation that we want to elicit, right? Like,
Hmm.
you mentioned that you have kids training 0.6, 0.5, 0.4 meters per second to start, which I think is really, really great because a lot of them lack control. So I'd rather slow it down a little bit and actually teach their body how to move and how to control the movement through some of these complex patterns like a squat or a deadlift or a bench press and so on that way. But a lot of people look at that and they'll say, well, I could train that same range with half the weight. And it's like, basically based on the VBT principles, there's not really any point in doing that, right? Like
Right.
if you're going to train
Right.
slow, make sure the load on the bar and the force you have to, exert to move it is high enough to elicit a stimulus. And if it's not, then you're not doing anything in your training. And I think that's an area where I've really liked the VBT from a rehab side is, I'll get these kids mid-stage ACL coming in. And obviously, one of my big principles is I want them to be stronger afterwards than they were beforehand, because obviously prior level of function was not enough to prevent injury. So
Right.
what do? I lean on squat. I lean on deadlift. I lean on some of these very, bang for your buck compound movements. And once I hooked them up to the VBT, I was looking at some of the things. I'm like, we're not loading them enough. We don't have enough weight on the bar. We need to put more on the bar. And that, in my mind, actually becomes a more significantly more effective and efficient way to train, because, instead of spending all this time wasting sessions and not getting results because we didn't load enough, we can now catch that in the moment and say, no, we need another 25 on each side, or we need another 10 on each side, or whatever it is. And we can kind of troubleshoot in the moment, as opposed to doing a 6 to 8 week block and then testing and looking back and saying, oh shoot, we didn't put enough on the bar. We actually catch it in the moment, and we're more effectively able to get people back to where they should be, and we're able to do that a lot faster, I feel. And
Mhm.
obviously I use that term faster to, pun intended, when we're talking about VBT, I guess you could say. But that's the other side of the coin too, right? Is obviously if we're doing the lighter weight, we need to be able to move it fast. And I think from a power production standpoint, there's a whole lot of bang for your buck in moving things really, really fast. But if your whole goal is power production, you need to know how fast they're moving and when they drop off, right? Because if I want an
Mhm.
athlete to produce a lot of power, and all of a sudden, I program 20 reps for them, and at rep 10, their velocity goes from a 1.5 to a 1.0, I'm not getting the speed stimulus I want anymore. So why am
Right.
I going to continue to train that pattern if I'm not getting the stimulus I want to, right? If we have track athletes, you mentioned you worked with a track athlete before, and we want them to get really good at the 100, do we send them out and make them run 40 rounds of a 100-meter sprint? Or do we time it and we say, hey, look, that was a good one, rest 3 to 5 minutes, then we're going to do the next one, right? We build
Mhm.
in time to recover. We make sure that if we're trying to get an athlete faster, that they're actually running fast. Well, the same is true for power production, right? Why is it so complex for us to, like, if we're trying to train power and the athlete no longer trains power, why are we still making them rep it out? It's just a waste of time at that point.
Yeah. Well, there's, in your sort of realm, when I hear people talk about VBT and you bring up something like readiness, one of the one of the things that until you start integrating data into the training, until you start gamifying it, one of the things that you miss is that readiness is going to be contextual to so many different factors, right? If I'm training a group in the morning, like we'll jump at the beginning of most of our workouts. If I'm training a group in the morning, they don't jump as well. At the same group of people does not jump as well at in a 10 a.m. session as they do in a 3 p.m. session. The 3 p.m. session out jumps everyone else. The 5 p.m. session doesn't jump as well as the 3 p.m. session. Why? Because they did something at 3 p.m. They're tired, mentally or physically, they're tired. That 10 a.m. session, they should be fresh. They haven't done anything physical yet. They're not awake. They're not alert. They're not excited. So, like, if you only test, and furthermore, like, if you got a kid who he saw his girlfriend in between classes, she's got to get to practice and he's going to get to the weight room, and they do whatever kids do and meet up in the hallway, on in passing. That kid's going to show up a little more excited, and he's going to be closer to his like true readiness is going to be on display, versus another kid who's coming from a math test that he thinks he failed. And like, those two kids, if you were to test them in 5 minute intervals throughout the workout, you would see that one kid raises significantly. One kid will have a predictable raise, and one kid just came in where he is for the day. Like, so you start to see, like, whether it's with jumps or with VBT, or whatever it is, I see a lot of like readiness testing that with all this stuff. Again, that's why I say like the democratization of it is so exciting, because you get so many more people experimenting, and you get so many different variations of all of these different uses. And most discoveries are made accidentally. So the sort of sweet spot is when you get like pretty smart people doing pretty stupid things. Like you rig up something that's just foolish, like it shouldn't work that way, but you rig it up and you test it long enough to you test it sort of long enough to understand how it fits within where your athletes typically would be, and you start to see like, oh, this has a downstream effect on something else. At Westside, they were always experimenting with, probably a quarter of the training was just purely experimental, just to, enough of it would remain constant on their, they use 3-week waves, I use 3-week waves, enough of it remains constant. But then you always have something that you are purposefully, hey, for the next 3 to 6 weeks, we're going to try this way. And we're going to see, because I know roughly how my kids should respond week over week. I know which kids are good on week 1, which kids, like some kids, if they can move a weight, they can move it at whatever speed they can move it. But if it gets an ounce too heavy, that, like all of a sudden they have massive drop off. Other kids, they can move any weight heavy, but they just can't move fast. And part of that is, I think a lot of like rate of force development and stuff is it's cognitive, it's learned. You're trying to trick them into, there's the component of creating the tension that makes the physical adaptation, but there's also, again, these are kids, especially with male athletes, like they don't have fully developed frontal lobes, and they're not going to until 99.9% of them are done, even if they play professionally. Why you look at like, why are certain players, dominant in like their really late 20s, early 30s, talking like all-time greats? Why are they dominant at that point where their physical selves should be falling off? When Jordan or Kobe were losing a step, when Steph is losing a step, when LeBron's losing a step, why are they still increasingly dominant through like those early 30s? And it's like, oh, because their frontal lobes have only now really been online for a couple years, and now they're able to like understand data about what they're doing in a more like complex and holistic manner. Like they could collect data before, but they couldn't really interpret it, and their sort of focus of self is so inherently selfish at that point, like where they don't have that third person perspective. So they have physical tools, but they don't know they don't have an actual understanding of how to use them. You watch great quarterbacks and how they evolve through their early and mid 30s, where they've lost it. They are definitely physically not what they used to be. The ball doesn't have the same zip, and yet they're far more efficient players. And it's like, because they get to this point where now they can understand everything because their minds have come online. All that is to say, like with VBT, whether it's VBT, timing gates, jumping, whatever it is, radar with throwing athletes, all of that helps them to contextualize what is happening. And now when they rep to rep, they're experimenting. They're trying to do something new to get that higher number. And now, especially the more sensitive the instrument and the more instantaneous the feedback, you are giving them more and more ammunition to develop sort of a contextual web around what it is that they're actually trying to do. You're building the cognitive part along with the physical. And a lot of coaches will look at it and say like, well, I don't need that. And it's like, yeah, you don't. I don't need VBT. I know, like, I can tell you the difference between, even doing the velo bench yesterday, I could tell the difference between a rep that I hit at 1.97 meters per second and a rep that I hit at 204. I could tell that one was a higher average speed, but I could tell that the other had a higher peak velocity. I could feel that because I've done tens of thousands of reps. My kids can't tell the difference between hitting a 1.2 and a 1.6. They can't tell what they look like at all. But as you start to give them feedback, and I use like ground contact time stuff in much the same way, as you start to simply give them this information regularly, they develop meaning for it. And that helps them to again, if the intention of your training and the feedback, like if those two things line up, you see explosive gains that are far outside of what most textbooks would tell you. Because again, the textbooks are written before the invention of any technology that would allow you to solve this premise. So even with that, like there are things that we will learn in the next 10 to 20 years that will augment even what I'm talking about now in theory, because they're things that we don't know about and we have no understanding of. There's, missing pieces of the puzzle that we will, again, smart people will do stupid things and they'll come across, or like Louis would say all the time, that he made the most discoveries in the last, 2 decades of his life. He said, not from his training, not from his athletes, because they all kind of had the same background at that point. Like they all got to the same level where they were all seeing things almost like too close. And then someone would come in who would be younger, less experienced, even like the value of like so many discoveries have been made by people who have learning disabilities because it simply, they get a little confused and ask a question that no one else thought to ask. And it's because like they misheard something along the way. So trying to reconcile the angle of a problem that just no one had framed up before. And it causes someone else to go, I already had this piece of information. I already had this piece of information. What I never had was any reason to look at how did the two connect. And as soon as you realize I make discoveries this way all the time because someone will like read a tweet and say like, hey, so are you saying this and this? I'm like, no, I was talking about 2 completely different things. But now you bring up a really interesting point. You could theoretically do, and like it might not be right, but it gets you just close enough to consider 2 points of information that you already knew that you had never had the impetus to juxtapose and compare. But so with all of that, like people, they get VBT and they immediately go run to do the thing that they've seen all of the experts do. But number one, like most experts, like there's not really reason to put most people above yourself. Like most of the experts that we look up to, like odds are they probably train less than you. They probably train less people than you. You know why they're experts is because they have time to get up on stage and talk in front of people. And like that time, all that time comes at the expense of being in the gym, doing the training, being with the athletes. So it's like the first thing that you should do is hook up VB, like what you've been doing that you're pretty sure was working. Just monitor it for like 3 to 6 weeks. Just see what are the relationships that you see in your own system, because your system, hopefully you're doing your system because you've seen results from it. Now, how do you augment your system? By really looking at like what in my system is doing the work and what is dead weight. And then you cut the dead weight. And a lot of like, that's what I'm always trying to do is what can I simplify? Because if I can simplify it, then that means that I can pull out work that's not causing adaptation, which means now that same athlete is like fresher. We're getting the same rate of adaptation, but doing less work to get there. Now they're fresher, but now I can try sort of to like a load management point. Like I want to build their, I got to maintain their general physical preparedness or build it, their work capacity. I'm very big on work capacity. So, but now you have more time to experiment with. Now you have more time to input another variable and then see how does that stack up to the last 3 to 6 weeks.
Right, exactly. I mean, there's a principle that 80% of your results come from 20% of your effort. So this allows you to find what that 20% is and put a lot more stock into that 20%. If 80% of the results come from 20% of the effort, what if that 20% that we're doing becomes 100% of what we're doing, right? The sky's the limit at that point for these kids. And going back to your point too on frontal lobe development and how things have evolved over the past few decades, I mean, the concept of the like neuromotor control and motor control theories being applied to strength and conditioning is not something I've seen well developed looking back at 30, 40, 50-year history. But I think it's emerging a lot more now in the sense that we're starting to understand these complex neural systems and how they impact what we see from a strength standpoint. So much so that we can cause significant acute change by just doing small things to modulate the nervous system that way. So I think that's a really exciting emerging frontier. And your point on the data collection too. I mean, this is where having a device like the OVR is perfect because you get all the data for every rep that the device is attached for pretty much everything you do, right? You get the range of motion that the kids are performing, you get the barbell velocity, max and average, and so on that way. It's really easy to track because you just pull it up in the app and it's right there. It simplifies things quite a bit. And one of the things that I've noticed that's been really interesting to me is how their depth of motion changes in response to the set itself. What does rep 1 look like versus rep 8? Because there's some athletes that I work with that actually get lower as the set goes on and they're hitting a better depth and they're maintaining that velocity throughout that better depth. And others, they're not getting as low and they're almost, I don't know if it's a fatigue thing or using your term work capacity. I don't know if they just have the engine built up to sustain it for the reps that we're looking at. And they're actually shortening their rep range in order to maintain velocity of movement that way. So it's really interesting how we kind of see, a lot of different things being done by the athletes that way, but those are things that we would have never even considered or we would have never even looked at or picked up with our own two eyes if it wasn't for having the technology and the device that way. So I think that the other piece to that as well, as you mentioned about the guys and gals that get up on stage a lot and the industry leading experts, but I certainly think to a point a lot of the experts are the people who are in the trenches doing the work day in and day out, and they tend to be a little bit further ahead of where the research and literature tends to be just because they're seeing stuff in real time. And this is a great way to kind of almost make everything that you do, every training block you program, its own case study and case series because you get the data right in front of you immediately. So it allows you to kind of conduct your own experiments. And you mentioned in Westside that they were playing around a lot and trying a lot of new things. And that's something that I do in rehab. And I think that any coach or physical therapist or chiropractor, really anyone out there should be willing to try. It's okay to take 5 minutes of every session and play around and try new things and do things you never thought to do before, because to your point, that's how things are going to move forward. One of the things that I have been considering playing around with yet, but I haven't because I really wanted to get your thoughts on it actually, is I'm really into weighted chin-ups, pull-ups, dips, basically weighted loaded calisthenics. And there's this emergence of this new thing that they call street lifting, which is literally competitions for weighted pull-up and weighted dip. And there's standards similar to what you have in powerlifting for, rep range and pause and so on that way with certain exercises. And the thought crossed my mind. I was like, you could take the little VBT Velcro strap, put it right through the lifting chain and essentially train velocity-based weighted calisthenics in a way that no one has done before. And I'd be interested to see, do we see the days when people are, grinding out pull-ups with 300 pounds strapped to them and dips with 300 pounds strapped to them? Because the people that do that nowadays, I could probably count them on one or two hands versus where it could be in 5 to 10 years time.
Stepping back just a little to like the sort of beginning of your statements there, like when I say, I guess elevating an expert, there's a critical part. Again, I come from a filmmaking background, which is just storytelling. So storytelling is the reconciliation of the events of time upon a character. And I'm really into training. Training is the reconciliation of the events of time upon a character. They're the same kind of thing, but it's so I look at everything as this like sort of acknowledgement of where people are on a continuum there, so in talking about, in talking about looking at experts, like experts are experts on their story, right? Like you can, it's not to like dismiss, to dismiss academia or dismiss, not saying that you made this point, more so that I just want to clarify it for myself. It's not to dismiss research or sort of more traditional schools of thought and methods of learning. It's it's to just further contextualize of like, the research is going to be based on a certain setting, right? And looking at any exercise. The language around exercise is largely arbitrary to me. Like to say a loaded calisthenic, it to me is like, okay, so lifting. Or to say, like
there could be a
I'll have
whole nother
kids.
podcast at some point about the language of exercise and movement, because what some people
Yeah,
call a foam roller, others call a barrel roller, and it's just we can't
yeah,
agree on anything.
yeah. But it's all like, okay, so ultimately what we're looking at is always force applied to like tissue. Like whether that force is the load of the body weight of the lifter, the mass of the lifter and gravity. It's just applied. I see so many times arguments over like, well, it's okay to do that movement if it's unloaded. I just go like, what does that mean? That has zero meaning, because no one's doing that movement in space. You are under load when you're sleeping. I just lost 50 pounds. I can tell you, you are under load all the time. It's not until that load is removed from you that you realize, oh, like that's how much was on me. But so looking at, yeah, if something is true, it's true all the time. That's why we have laws, right? That's why math works, and everything in life is math. I'm a published artist, and I will tell you there is no such thing as art. Some people will say that food is art. Food is not art. Food is art to the consumer. It is chemistry to the chef. Art is usually chemistry to the artist. The artist is following a mathematical sequence to get to what they want. Now, they might be experimenting and trying to set up the formula in a different way. They might be trying to experiment with an element of the formula. But so in talking about, again, like experts and whatnot, that's what I'm getting at, is that I'll see lots of studies about like, well, the ratio of, they tested a whole bunch of athletes. There's one coach who has done essentially the same study 3 times, and he's published the results all 3 times. He did it in high school, and he found that athletes made strength gains or made significant speed gains until they hit 2.1 times body weight squat. And after that, the correlation between how much more they could squat relative to their body weight and how fast they ran broke down. Okay, well, there's not a whole lot of high school athletes who are out there squatting like 2.4, 2.5 times body weight. But he reran this study at a mid-level university, and he found that that held true until 1.9 times body weight. And then he ran it again in the NFL, and he found 1.7. But you start to think about that and you go, number one, a squat is only telling you what's happening at the knee and the hip. It's not telling you what's happening at the foot and the ankle. And running is a series of, exchanges of energy and impulse through collision. That collision happens through the feet hitting the turf, the feet hitting the track. So number one, you're trying to correlate something that doesn't tell you anything about how the feet or the ankles were trained. My athletes, a huge part of our training is like sled work, trap bar carries, belted marches, things that particularly are hard on the foot and ankle. We do a lot of hurdle hops and things like that. So we're building up that lower limb, that foot, the ankle. We're trying to, create a hard mallet so that when we hit the turf, we hit the track, there is a clean exchange. It's a cue ball hitting the other balls versus a soft, squishy mallet, gently compressing, or, a foot hitting sand. So just number one, like that comparison doesn't make a ton of sense, especially when you lack the context of the preparedness of the foot and the ankle. Now, if you had both, if you could kind of create 2 ratios and say, well, if your lower ratio is this and your higher ratio is that, then you at least have some further context. But so you start to look at like, had that time, doing scouting reports for the NFL, like you look at what are the common traits of guys who make it to the NFL versus the ones who don't. The ones who make it to the NFL are vastly more elastic than the ones that don't. So their feet have greater stiffness. They transfer energy to the turf better. So you go, okay, so his NFL group needed less relative squat strength to run the same speeds. They're also a far more elastic group. His high school group, which had fewer college players and almost no future NFL players in it, they needed higher ratios of strength to run the same speed. Well, what do 99% of us train? Guys who are not in the NFL, like guys who are hoping to get there, but are not genetically sort of predisposed to getting there. When they get on the field, they have to run with the elastic freaks, right? So maybe acknowledge that they aren't the elastic freak and drive their strength up more to account for that shortfall, but don't follow the same ratio. Don't go, oh, I'm going to take my non-elastic athlete and I'm only going to get them to 1.7 and because I assume that everything after that is wasteful. It's like, no, to look at this one man's findings, his writing seems to suggest the opposite, but his data seems at odds with his own with the popular conclusions from the same stories. It seems to say, okay, well, if I'm lacking that genetic component, I need to make up for it. I need to offset it through this trainable physical component. But so there's a lot of that where if you ran that same study with my kids, we do more foot and ankle work. So if my kids can get to those extreme ratios, they should be faster than someone else's kids in the same town who neglects the foot and ankle. So any findings, the findings are always contextual to like everyone is an expert on their process, or at least they should be an expert on their process. A lot of people are just mimicking someone else and going, well, it's supposed to work. So I just leave it on auto and I kind of hands off and I just keep going through, you're either sort of like performance and results based or you're like tradition based in training and coaching. That's kind of the two modes of you're either doing it because the ritualistic practice of doing something is satisfying to you for some reason, or you're doing it because it gets you a result. And if you care about the result, you pay attention to the result. Like it's real easy. If you don't care about VBT and like you have neither the interest nor have you gone out and gotten it, then you don't care about it. Like you're going to get less out of it because you're not interested in it.
Right.
But if you're interested in it, if you're interested in paying attention to it, you're going to get far more out of it because you're going to pay attention to things I have not said. You're going to pay attention perhaps to things I've never thought. And again, you're going to come to conclusions because I don't know the specifics of everyone else's, training. You asked a second part there and I talked for so long that I forgot.
Yeah, no, we were talking about like weighted pull-ups and dips and possible.
Oh yeah. Those all, I've got some kids right now, like pull-ups are they're a thing that we do regularly and they're such a hard thing.
Yep.
You get, especially now, like, again, I'm going to pair this up with a brief tangent, but like, I'm really interested in, I'm back in my home city. When I was in high school, and granted, I was very large. I was the strongest kid on my team. I benched 370 in high school, but we had 5 kids who benched 340 or more in that high school. I went back and coached at that high school, 20 years later. We had 1 kid who benched 300 pounds. The size of the high school had grown significantly. It was like 30%, more kids, and yet far less kids who could hit the same relative standards. And you start to think about like, well, of course that makes sense because I didn't get a cell phone until spring of my senior year, and all it did was make phone calls. And the only person who ever called me was my mom. So that phone was very boring. I didn't like playing Snake. I only had level 1. I didn't want to, I couldn't pay for the added levels or whatever. Like it was boring. So my head wasn't down all day. I was, out being physical, and you drove by the parks. Kids were playing in the park. You look at weightlifting standards in the state of Florida or track. you see this happening in both sports at large scale, like statewide. And I bet you, if anyone looks at big enough numbers, it's happening nationwide. It's been happening. I trained I trained a kid who long jumped in 2021. He was the nation's #1 long jumper in high school. He beat the next closest kid by nearly a foot. He set the state record for the state of Florida. He was, state champion, national champion. He jumped 25.5. Super long. Now, in most years, there is at least one kid who outdoes that. But in that year, 2021, probably because coming off of a COVID year, it was a bit suppressed. So likewise, because it's coming off of COVID year, I still believe he would have been #1. It just maybe would have been like a 26.3 or something. But the point being, when you started to look at like what got you to states, the kids who win state, those numbers go up pretty predictably. Every couple years, somebody new is setting a state record. And that's because you get this combination of a couple kids here or there who get really good training, specialize early, and get really good skill coaching. But simultaneously, the average kid is heavier than they've ever been, weaker than they've ever been, more out of shape than they've ever been. So you start to look at like what gets you 6th place at some of these state and regional meets. And you realize like, man, that wouldn't get you out of districts 20 years ago. That wouldn't get you, you get 6th in the region with that. That wouldn't have got you a medal at a local meet 20 years ago. Because the average kid is so much worse. The average kid is relatively weak. The average kid is vastly, underprepared. That's why we see so many injuries now. I work with a lot of baseball players. You got kids who are, super weak, and they've been learning how to, throw fastballs from this really, like, I get kids routinely who are like, oh, I throw 77 miles an hour. And I go, how? You can't bench 85. And it's like, oh, I just, snap my elbow in half every throw, and I'm 14 years old. And you go like, can you do a body weight squat? Like, can you just get into like, like an Asian squat, like as if we used an Asian toilet? Can you do that? No, they fall over. They can't do a parallel squat with body weight. They collapse. And yet they can throw these velocities that we used to have to try. Like we used to have to get there through just like going out and playing all the time. But we'd have inefficient mechanics. We'd have low skill, and just, good old fashioned American horsepower would make it go. These kids are figuring out ways through, technical coaching to circumvent all of the missed, as workarounds for all of the missed physical development that their childhoods didn't give them. And so now, like, you used to have to earn the right to snap your body in half. These kids can do it easily now because like they've learned hacks. And, as a result, kids are coming in with wild injuries that I'm like, I didn't know anyone who had that injury until like 2010. And they were 30. And now, I know 14-year-olds who come to me arm in a sling and say, hey, coach, next semester I'm going to start lifting with you when the doc clears me from this. And I go like, how did that happen? I had a kid a couple of years ago who he was 15, and he said, well, my ortho told me that I shouldn't lift weights. And I said, like, your ortho? Like, I've never had a surgery, like I've done a lot of stupid things. I played a lot of football. I've broken a lot of bones, tendons and ligaments have never snapped. And I've squatted 670 and pulled over 600 and benched 450. And I've done I've done 400-pound plus, sets of 5 on good mornings to parallel. Like I've done brutal things to my body for the lifespan of my body. But I had a childhood that, looked more like Stranger Things or something, where, we got home, we took off on our bikes, you went to a park, your parents didn't know where you were. and like you fell off it, you came home with cuts and bruises and scrapes, maybe a big knot on your forehead from getting hit by a rock or something. And like, we were all fine, but we were all robust because we did it so often. And now these kids don't get that variation of movement. I know we're way off topic of VBT at this point, but like you see all these kind of things where, you're theoretically, I guess, like VBT can help you get back to where you can acknowledge like, hey, this kid might be really skilled, but simultaneously they are a very novice. They're extra young in a setting like the weight room. They have all this extra development. But we were talking about pull-ups. That's how this is what happens in my head. I go, I know I'm way off topic. Where was I? Pull-ups. So we get to, it's harder than ever to get kids that first pull-up. And I always had in the back of my mind, like Louis would say, like, singles build reps, reps don't build singles, and so like the first time the hardest thing is just, can I get you to one pull-up, or even can I get you to like a half a pull-up? Because if I can get you to if I can just get you to like show some range of movement, because I have kids all the time who like it is hard for them to hold their body weight when they first show up. Just simply to grab the bar and hold. That's how weak a lot of kids come in. So it becomes this like hard thing nothing really prepares you for a pull-up like a pull-up. Like you have to be able to get at least part of a pull-up. You have to be able to get to at least part of, straining towards getting your chest up, towards getting your chin up. But then once you get there, you get number 1 this week, you might get number 3 next week. You might get you might get 6 by the end of the month. And then real quickly, it becomes that singles build reps, but reps don't build singles. So we get to, I never have my kids do more than 6 pull-ups, but I've got multiple kids who we use a loading pin and basically the same thing that we do our belted marches with. They'll use a loading pin and a nylon sling. And I've got at least 2 kids who are well over 100 pounds, and they're baseball players. They're both, one at a body weight of 121, I believe, was doing 115 on a weighted pull-up. I may have had some slightly larger kids go heavier than that. I think like 125 might be our weight room record, but yeah, you can definitely use VBT to train that. It's all a matter of figuring out with the range of motion. If it's a longer range of motion, you kind of have to make that adjustment on the speed. So like say using VBT as a cutoff, you use a higher cutoff on, say, a squat, because it's a longer range of motion than, say, a bench press. So your cutoff on a squat, you might, if you don't trust the kid, you might tell them like, hey, the moment you see like something in the low 0.3s, that's your top set. We're done there. If they dip into the 0.2s, you say, cool, we're definitely done there. But with a more experienced lifter, they might get down to that 0.2 range, low 0.2. Likewise on bench, 0.15 might be I might be able to grind certainly into the 0.1s, right down around 0.1. I'm sure the first time I hit 405, I'm sure was below a 0.1. My kids, my young kids who come in, even if we're maxing, like, hey, tell me when you get under 0.25. The first rep that's under 0.25, you're done. So getting into those 0.2s for a bench might be sort of within the realm of maximal. Getting into the 0.3s with a newer lifter might be within the realm of maximal on a squat. So using thresholds that are contextual that way. But so anyways, with a pull-up, pending your range of motion, how much your scapula is, still retracted or not retracted at the bottom, that's going to mean more time, greater range of motion, more space between 0 and 0. So if you're using average velocity, it'd probably be a really hard movement for peak velocity. So if you're using average, you might have to account for that of like, it would be more like a squat type number. or squat type range versus a bench type range. So you
Right.
have to gear it up a little to be a little faster.
Right. No, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And Michael, I realize we can probably bro it out and talk about these things all day long because you brought up
Yeah.
so many amazing points that we could build off of for hours, from the evolution of training and what we're seeing in the youth these days compared to what it used to be, and so on that way. There's a lot of other points that we made that could literally be podcast episodes in themselves that way. But do you have any kind of closing thoughts or closing remarks or anything else that we missed as we were chatting today?
No, I mean, go check out OVRperformance.com. Uh, gotta get that in there. Otherwise, my partners are going to be angry with me. But with whatever it is, like my closing thoughts, I guess, would be when you get tools like VBT, timing gates, jump devices, don't throw out your training. Don't throw out what has been working for you entirely. Don't intend on throwing it out at all. Number one, get it and start simply tracking, and then try to integrate those tools sort of as frequently as you can so that you can start to see, so that you can start to see what's the effect of your training, day to day on those results. Because especially if you're looking to get from a training focus to have any element of like actual testing, you need to know sort of how the periodization of your training actually works. You need to know, and that's another great route that I could have talked down if I wasn't going in 50 directions, but like to actually know, to get that feedback consistently enough. The more you do it, the more you're going to realize how it can be useful for your very specific situation. And the better idea you're going to have of, again, those day to day and those week to week effects that your training itself has. Do you see bigger fall offs? Let's say if you're on a 4 day a week program like me, going Monday through Thursday in a high school setting, like I know people who swear by they don't test anything on Monday. Monday becomes like a primer for Tuesday and Wednesday. That's their sweet spot for testing. I like testing Monday because I know what they're going to look like by Wednesday or Thursday. Or I know, even again, school to school, town to town, sport to sport, you're going to have all of these nuances and things that devices like what we offer from OVR Performance, the inferences into your own training that they're going to allow you to see, and the discoveries that they're going to allow you to make. You can certainly, and we have a 6-week program that I put up on through OVR that you can sign your email up for or whatever and get for free, like for a 6-week, just, hey, here's everything. It's everything that my athletes ran for like a year and a half window. So you can see if you need a jumping off point or a starting point, like, hey, here's what I did with it. But by no means are you locked into what I do, because what I do might not make sense where you are. But I guarantee you there's 1,000 other coaches who are in a similar situation to you. And there's 10,000 different inferences that you can make about your training and ways to trim the fat or lean heavier into the areas that you think work, or help solve problems that maybe you see the problem come up over and over again, but you're having trouble identifying what does it stem from. All of these tools are designed to help you to do that, and they just keep the training more novel and fun for the athlete. You'd be amazed what happens when you start showing a kid a quantifiable number and say, all right, try and beat that. Or we're going to add 5 pounds, try and hit it again. With no periodization, you can just go, hey, every time you hit the number, we're going to add 5 to 10 pounds. And next set, I want you to try and hit the number again. And
Yep.
You'd be amazed. You can get a kid to go up 40, 50 pounds in a single session, just set to set doing that, where all of a sudden you see how a kid that you're having trouble, communicating with, you give them that gamified strategy, and it's like they forget that you're in the room, or now they suddenly acknowledge that you're in the room because now you're there to help them get a higher score versus being some sort of training overlord who, yells at them and it has a whistle or something.
Right. No, I think that's a great point. And we'll obviously link to OVR in the description below as well. That way you can catch out everything that Michael and the team are doing there. And I mean, just speaking from personal experience, it's been a great product. I'm glad we've been able to use it clinically on our end. And obviously, I highly recommend it to others as well. And then next time we catch up and chat, we'll have to get into the origins of your own handle that way, where Burn the Ladders came from. But we'll save that for the sequel. So.
All right.
Michael, this was awesome. I really appreciate your time and I really appreciate your knowledge and insights, man. Thank you.
No problem.